Namaskar, welcome to this session. Let me introduce myself very briefly. I am Nandini Sinha Kapoor, a professor with School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Study at Indira Gandhi National Open University. Today, for the next few minutes, I am going to speak on social and civil society movements for the protection of natural environment in India with reference to the historical context in India. This is a part of your ongoing online course on PG Diploma in Environment and Occupational Health. Human civilization and human intervention have shaped the contours of natural landscape and natural environment from the Paleolithic age, that is Old Stone Age, to the modern times. We always have photos of hunting, village farming to industrialization. Archaeological history and anthropological evidences clearly indicate that human civilization shaped the contours of natural environment throughout the centuries. From prehistoric times to colonial times, society and state have shaped the contours of natural environment for the economic growth and sustainability of a growing Indian civilization and state societies. The human society eked out their living in the prehistoric times, that is both in the Paleolithic, Old Stone Age and Middle Stone Age, Mesolithic period, through hunting and gathering. Neolithic age or the farming age, or as known as in archaeological terms the New Stone Age, witnessed the beginnings of subsistence, agricultural activities and emergence of villages. As subsistence agriculture expanded into surplus agriculture, we witnessed the beginnings of urbanization and emergence of cities. The urban society utilized water resources for agrarian expansion to produce surplus production to sustain majority of non-agricultural urbanized section society. It is important to know that it is the environmental factors which were responsible for the decline of the Indus or Harappan civilization, which is also known as cradle of the Indian and South Asian civilization. What were the natural factors and environmental factors that led to the decline of such a huge urban civilization, such as earthquake, floods and silting of river Indus and its major tributaries? It is obvious that overutilization of natural resources without ensuing regeneration of environmental resources played havoc with Indus Valley civilization and was responsible for its decline. Viewers and listeners, you can have a look at reconstructed urbanization of the Harappan society. Here is a photo. Here is the original excavated city of Harappan civilization. You can see big craters, hole-like structures. These were granaries, very famous, the granaries to store grains in the Harappan cities. Yet another view of Harappan city. Now let's come to the Mauryan Empire in the post-Harappan period. The Mauryan Empire is known for tapping into natural resources in strengthening its revenue base. A detailed study of Ashokan inscriptions and Kautilya's Arthashastra clearly reveal that the Mauryan state expanded agricultural activities into forest and tribal regions to augment their revenue income. Heavy taxation system of the Mauryan encouraged fallow land to be brought under cultivation, and peasants were exempted from agricultural taxes for bringing fallow land under cultivation. It is equally interesting that the ancient world was concerned about environmental protection, such as measures taken by Emperor Ashoka in the Mauryan Empire in conserving natural resources through afforestation, plantation, digging of wells, ban on the killing of deers and peacocks in royal kitchens on certain days. So we have a series of what is called major rock edicts and pillar edicts, the inscriptions of Emperor Ashoka Maurya, in which all these instructions were written in Brahmi script and Prakrit language. Very soon I am going to show you some of the images, photos of Ashokan inscriptions. Early medieval period of Indian history, that is 7th to the 13th centuries, witnessed processes of state formation and agricultural expansion further into hinterland and tribal habitat throughout the subcontinent. It is true that plenty of availability of land did not lead to any social or civil movement, as we do not have any documented evidence of environmental movement for early India. However, medieval India witnessed conflicts just like medieval Europe over common resources. What were these common resources? Like village grazing land, village agricultural land, village ponds, village water resources, lakes, and similar natural resources. Here is an image of Ashokan major rock edict, rock inscriptions written in Brahmi script, as I said, and in Prakrit language. Yet another very nice image of Ashokan inscription. Some of the inscriptions in northwest frontier were written in Kharoshthi script, not in Brahmi script, in Aramaic script, and even in Greek script, because of the population reading and speaking those dialects, and not in Brahmi. But in the heartland of the Indian subcontinent, Ashokan inscriptions were written in Brahmi script, and mostly they were in Prakrit language. Yet another image. Now we come to the first historically documented social and civil society movement for protection of environmental resources in Indian history, and it happened in the medieval period. It is in the third desert of India that the first civil society movement for environmental protection arose, which has been well documented in the historical literature. This is the famous Bishnoi movement of western Rajasthan, founded by Saint or Sant Jambhoji in Bikaner in 1453. Bishnois have been in news and in the newspaper also because of an incident in which the Bombay film star Salman Khan and some of his colleagues were involved in killing black buck in the desert, of hunting and killing the black bucks, very beautiful local population of deers in the third desert, in Bikaner, when they were shooting for a film, and he was booked for it. Bishnoi movement in medieval Rajasthan. One of the earliest environmental movements in historic India was the Bishnoi movement in medieval Rajasthan. It was founded by a Parmar Rajput, Jambhoji, in Bikaner. Jambhoji was born to a Parmar Rajput named Lohat and his Bhati Rajput wife Hansa. An agro-pastoralist, Lohat, received divine message, Akashvani, that a Krishna-like avatar would be born to him to liberate 12 crore human beings. In fact, Jambhoji, like infant Krishna, performed miracles and surprised visitors to his home. Bishnoi philosophy of conservation of vegetation and movement for environmental protection. Let's have a look at it. The Bishnoi movement had a wide following in the desert community of western Rajasthan in the medieval period. Its philosophical and socio-economic content enjoyed popularity among the local population of Rajputs, Jats, and Rabadis or Raikas, that is the caste of camel breeders, because it made a significant difference to their life. Following Bishnoi philosophy, Bishnoi teachings made significant difference to the local population of Rajputs, Jats, and Rabadis or Raikas, that is the camel breeder caste of western Rajasthan. The Bishnoi concern for environmental protection ensured improvement in the living conditions of the desert community. The concern assumed significant proportion against the backdrop of the series of famines that struck Bikaner, that hit Bikaner and its surrounding regions, and historically documented great famines were in AD 1450, 1485 and 1490 in western Rajasthan, followed by those of 1742, 1747, 1792, 1796, 1804, 1812 to 1816, 1837 to 38, 1866 to 1869, 1890 to 92, famines, series 1898 to 1900, 1901 to 1902, and 1938-39. Bikaner region witnessed yet another series of famines in 1834, 1849, 1860, 1868 to 69, 1889 to 92, and 1899. So we can see that historically there are documented series of famines in Western Rajasthan, particularly in Bikaner. And the very importance and significance of Vishnoi teaching, they assume importance because of this backdrop of series of these failures of crop, failures of rain, and famines. That's the most important part. The fact that the Vishnois of Rajasthan and Haryana are a living culture today, despite the recurrent famines, indicates the continuing relevance and contemporary relevance of the Vishnoi philosophy and teaching of medieval saints. I have written a long essay in my second book, and the book is called, you can see my name, Nandini Sinha Kapoor, written Tribes, Agropastoralists and Environment in Western India. It's not an edited book, I'm sorry for the typo, but it's a fully written book by myself. 7 to the 20th Centuries, published by Manohar Publisher, New Delhi, 2011. If you have time, do get hold of this book and have a look and read the article on the Vishnois. Here is a Vishnoi with its flock of sheep in Western Rajasthan. Here is a Vishnoi village, Vishnoi huts with nicely painted motifs on them. Yet another Vishnoi village with nicely painted motifs of plants, flowers on the huts. There is a image of Ganeshji on one of the huts. In the middle hut you can see. Now let us look at the story of the founder of the Vishnoi movement, Jambhoji. Following Jambhoji's preachings and teachings, he is one of the most well-known followers. Biloji, another saint, widened the scope for conservation of nature by highlighting the environmental and economic importance of vegetation, particularly the khejri tree. Khejri tree is known as the lifeline of a desert because khejri tree can survive in the worst of the worst famine conditions too without water. Let us remember that important point about khejri tree. The Vishnois were not only inspired to sacrifice their lives for the protection of cattle but also for the preservation of trees. Jambhoji compared truth and falsity with two types of trees, sweet and salty. Bilhoji narrated the story of Jambhoji's disciple Karamni, who sacrificed her life in 1604 for the protection of khejri trees, the lifeline of the desert, as the trees can survive, just now I said, severe drought conditions. Khinwani and Netu are the two other heroes who laid down their lives for saving trees. So there are lot of stories that abound in the history of the Vishnoi movement, in which the local population, the local Rajput population, they laid their lives in saving trees, in saving the trees from failing, from getting them cut by the Rajput soldiers, by the local state soldiers. Here is a well-known image, photograph of the founder of Vishnoi movement, Jambhoji. You can see the halo surrounding him. Bhati Rajputs are condemned for felling trees, and other Jambhoji follower Mote gave up his life fighting against these Bhatis. Glorification of these martyrs is sought as hero Neetu attains heaven and immortality. Jambhoji's seat, Sambarthal, which is near Bikaner, is hailed because it abounds in forest and is habited by devout pastoralists. Jambhoji wandered in this forest but never cut any tree for wood. He only picked up the broken twigs to lit fires. Jambhoji encouraged his followers to grow mangoes out of thorny desert oaks. Among his miracles, the story of conversion of lime trees into coconut trees continues to be popular among his disciples. When human beings and animals seek shelter in the shadows of trees, they get respite from heat. Interestingly, Bilhoji laments that trees shed their leaves as soon as they are surrounded by human beings and animals. So on one hand, we see that the trees give respite from heat through their shades to the human beings and animals, but as soon as the trees are surrounded by the human beings and animals, they shed their leaves. So something negative starts happening to the trees. This is a clear indication of the Vishnui preference for conservation of vegetation. Water resources and agriculture. Bilhoji popularized conservation of the other scarce item of the desert, water. Conservation of water was not only to meet the daily needs of a desert society but also for agricultural activities. According to Bilhoji, when the rain comes, the cows get green grass to eat and water to drink. Hence, water is the foundation for good quality of milk and not any hymn or mantra. It was imperative to conserve rainwater at the local level both for drinking purposes and pastoral activities. When it rains, cattle grow up healthy and give plenty of milk. Milch cows graze on green grass that grows only after rains. Good quality fodder like bagaru and chandelevo grass, also used in kitchens, grow only if it rains. To sanctify the most scarce resource of desert, that is water, water is claimed to be the sacred Ban Ganga of the Puranic traditions in the literature of the Bishnois. The need for generation and conservation of water perhaps was the most important factor in the cultivation of grains for the sustenance of local population. The Bishnoi concern for agricultural activities to meet the local requirements is evident in Bilhoji's narrative of the famine of 1542 in Katha Guglaiki. The famine was terrible, but the starved population began to migrate elsewhere in search of livelihood. He demanded that the local population promise to save animals and birds and not kill them. If they promised to protect the animal wealth, only then God would remove their difficulties. This is a Vishnoi principle that connects conservation of cattle, wealth, and agricultural wealth. People doubted Jamboji's claim of the divine generation of food, but Bilhoji writes that wherever Jamboji preached, those places produced more grains, fruits, and flowers. That is obvious reasons because of the teachings for regeneration of local resources. In another account, Jamboji is said to have gone to a forest accompanied by a Purbiya and his camel laden with sacks. The Purbiya was delighted to see mounds of grains which Jamboji procured from the forest. The starved population acknowledged this miracle and received grain from Jamboji on every alternate days. Hence, Jamboji fed famine-struck people with grains and emphasized upon generation of grains through local cultivation and trade with fertile regions like Sindh. Water and good quality agricultural production are inextricably linked with each other and are always reflected in Bilhoji's teachings. Trees which receive plenty of water grow to have large branches and bear fruits and render cool shadows. In Katha Avatar Path, the story of Jamboji's birth, the predominance of pastoral wealth over agricultural activities is clearly evident. Jamboji's father, Parmar Lohat, who cultivated his field and irrigated it with water drawn from a well, had plenty of cows and goats. His agro-pastoral activities are vividly described by Bilhoji. Lohat grazed his cattle and spent money on his animals while procuring grains from the monsoon. Having completed the Bishnoi movement and the Bishnoi teachings and philosophy for conservation of natural, local, environmental resources in the desert, third of Western Rajasthan. Now I come to forest policies and tribal land displacement in the British colonial period for the next few minutes. Colonial rule was the first turning point in Indian history that a government claimed a direct proprietary right over the forests. This was not the case in pre-colonial times, including Mughal India. The British state became the conservator of forest when it passed the Indian Forest Act of 1878. Hundreds of thousands of acres of forest lands that Adivasis had used for centuries and were considered commons suddenly kept in reserve, a practice that continued for the rest of the colonial period. Consequently, revolts among the indigenous population became a routine phenomenon. What do you mean by indigenous population? Particularly, the colonial state intruded into the tribal hinterland in the habitat, and mainly the tribal revolts we can see. So, revolts among the indigenous population became a routine phenomenon during colonial period, especially in the 19th century. For instance, the famous ones are well documented in historical literature, such as 1855 the Santals rebelled, 1868 the Naigdas, in 1873 the Kolis, and 1895 Birsas led by famous Birsa Munda. This is only a small examples of total number of conflicts. Historians Ranajit Guha has documented over 110 different colonial era peasant revolts, as well as Catherine Gough records at least 77 such revolts and uprisings since the advent of the British rule. Here are some of the photos of conserved forest, the tiger sanctuaries. You can see tigers, and you have deers in the same tiger sanctuaries. This is Jim Corbett Park. British colonial rule in India ushered in a period of intense rebellion among the country's indigenous groups. Most tribal conflicts occurred in the British provinces, and many historians have documented how colonial policies gave rise to widespread rural unrest and violence. In the post-independence period, many of the colonial era policies continued to plague the system and were not reformed. Tribal conflicts continued in the form of the Naxalite insurgency. The princely state of Bastar continues to be a major center of tribal conflict in India. Till today, we all know that Naxalites operate in the state of Bastar, which is a part of present Chhattisgarh state, and they are quite a menace both to local population and to the state. This is Botanical Garden in Calcutta that the Britishers founded, very old trees which have been conserved there. Yet another photo of Botanical Garden. The new colonial policies such as the policing of forest lands and increased rural taxation led to the widespread discontent and rebellion among the indigenous groups. To quote a historian Stokes, resentment against the moneylenders boiled over most readily into violence among tribal people like the Bhils, Santals and the Gonds. Historians have shown that in the post-independence era, the new Indian government really did not reform a number of colonial period policies as far as tribal habitat and forest policies are concerned. So, the independent government of India did not really make much changes, especially those dealing with forestry and tribal conflicts. And tribal conflicts continue to occur throughout the country, especially in former areas of direct British rule like Bengal, Bihar and Jharkhand. Tribal revolts began in Bastar precisely because of increasing British influence in the state. These specific policies were implemented in Bastar that gave rise to tribal revolt. Colonial officials took direct control over the forest. They displaced tribals from their land and they interfered into succession to the local royal throne, which upset the native population. Bastar led to the rise of the contemporary Naxalite insurgency. It's been already mentioned to you. The case of Bastar reaffirms the role of British colonialism in producing tribal conflict in India by showcasing the effects in areas that never formally came under the ambit of the direct rule of the British colonial period. Here is a book, Bhumkal, the Tribal Revolt in Bastar by H.L. Shukla. Those of you are interested. Photo of the Gonds of Bastar. Despite its remote location, the political and economic development in colonial Bastar led to persistent rebellion and provide important insights for other regions throughout Asia. The British practice of retaining areas of indirect rule within a colony was adopted from India and exported to other colonial territories such as Burma and Malaysia. The survey and mapping of India's forests allowed the implementation of scientific management. The dominant paradigm of scientific management was to pursue the maximum sustainable production, and management practices were organized around the principle. In deforested areas, commercially valuable species were planted, while in some areas mixed forests were replaced with marketable monocultures. Continuing with the interest of colonial rulers, forest management and its restrictions to access local communities resulted in a steady buildup of forest capital. The forest capital was depleted during the World War I but regenerated through the intensive management. But again, deforestation occurred during the World War II, this time far beyond its sustained production. An increase of 65% over the war period does not indicate the timber not accounted for, which by all accounts is considerably greater when timber procured from other sources is also considered. Historians Gadgil and Guha point out that as the war proceeded, the area covered by working plants diminished, indicated increased in cutting of forests from the areas not covered with working plants, which would have been unaccountable. Large-scale annexation of Indian forests by colonial state constitute a critical turning point, politically, socially and ecologically, because of the colonial claim to forests represented an unprecedented expansion of state power and intervention with a simultaneous reduction in local communities' rights. Socially, the traditional patterns of resource use were disrupted by restrictions to local processes, and ecologically, as the forests were undergoing a process of commodification which transformed their nature. State control, which was a critical feature of 1878 Forest Act, also facilitated development of scientific forestry. Dietrich Brandes was the first Inspector General of Forest and is considered the founder of modern forestry, indeed often been paid tribute as the father of Indian forestry. One of the first tasks undertaken by the newly formed Forest Department was to survey the map of forest of India. Forests were demarcated so that the working plans could be formulated. According to 1878 Forest Act, 3 types of forest were to be designated: reserve, protected and the village. Reserve forests were supposed to be the most commercially valuable and amenable to sustained exploitation. Overall, state control of reserve forests was sought, which meant relinquishment or others' claims and rights. Limited access was granted. Legally, channels to contest the reservation of forests existed, though the rural communities had little experience with legal procedures. Protected forests were similarly state controlled, but some concessions were granted. Protected forest could also be close to fuel, wood collection and grazing whenever it was considered necessary. The Act also provided for a third designation of forest in the Constitution, village forest, and which was not under the control of the colonial government over most of India. The area of forest appropriated by the state in 1878 was 14,000 square miles, which was increased to 81,400 and 3,300 square miles for reserve and protected forests respectively by 1900. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you, viewers and listeners, for your patient hearing. All the best.